She stood on my front porch at 6 a.m., wielding a clipboard like a weapon and screaming about how my century-old family ranch was illegally constructed without proper permits. What Patricia Morrison didn't know was that I'd spent 20 years as a federal building inspector before retiring to this peaceful Montana valley. But by the time I was done with her, she'd learn exactly what happens when you mess with someone who actually knows building codes. I was sipping my morning coffee when I heard the car doors slamming in my driveway. Not one car, but three. Through my kitchen window, I watched a woman in a blazer march toward my front door like she owned the place, followed by two men carrying clipboards and wearing polo shirts that read, Pine Valley HOA Enforcement. The woman had that particular brand of confidence that comes from never being told no. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that somehow made her look both professional and completely unhinged. My name is Marcus Webb, and after 2 decades of inspecting federal buildings across the western states, I thought I'd seen every type of bureaucratic overreach imaginable. I was wrong. I'd retired to my grandfather's 500-acre ranch in the Bitterroot Valley 3 years ago, looking for peace and quiet after a career spent dealing with contractors who cut corners and officials who bent rules. The ranch had been in my family since 1923, complete with the original log cabin my great-grandfather built with his own hands, plus the main house my grandfather constructed in the 1960s. The knock on my door wasn't polite. It was the kind of aggressive hammering that law enforcement uses when they're serving a warrant. I opened the door to find Patricia Morrison, president of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association, holding an official-looking document and wearing a smile that could freeze antifreeze. "Mr. Webb," she announced without any pleasantries, "I'm here to inform you that your property has been found in violation of multiple building codes and HOA regulations. This structure," she gestured dramatically at my house, "was constructed without proper permits and must be brought into compliance immediately." I took a slow sip of my coffee and looked at her like she'd just claimed the sky was purple. "Ma'am, this house was built in 1967 with all proper permits. The original cabin dates to 1923. Both structures predate any HOA in this valley by about 40 years. Patricia's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in her eyes. "According to our research, no permits exist for construction at this address. Furthermore, as of January 1st, all properties within Pine Valley boundaries fall under HOA jurisdiction for safety compliance. We've had numerous complaints about the condition of your buildings." That's when I noticed the two men with her weren't just carrying clipboards. One had a professional camera, and the other was taking notes on what looked like an inspection form. They were documenting everything, building a case for something bigger than a simple violation notice. "I'd like to see those complaints," I said calmly, "and I'd like to know what authority you think you have to conduct inspections on private property." Patricia handed me a thick folder. "Everything's documented here. You have 30 days to begin remediation or face penalties up to $50,000 per structure. Additionally, we'll be filing a report with the county building department recommending immediate condemnation procedures." I flipped through the folder while she waited. Inside were photos of my property taken from various angles, a list of alleged violations that read like someone had thrown a building code manual at a wall and written down whatever stuck, and most interestingly, a survey map that claimed my ranch was now within something called the Pine Valley Community Development Zone. "This is fascinating," I said, still maintaining my calm, "because according to my deed and every county map I've ever seen, my property is unincorporated land with no HOA authority whatsoever." Patricia's smile finally cracked. "Property boundaries change, Mr. Webb. Development brings new requirements. We're simply ensuring all residents comply with modern safety standards." That's when I knew this wasn't about building codes or safety. This was about something else entirely. The way she said residents instead of property owners, the carefully worded language about development bringing new requirements, and most tellingly, the fact that she'd brought a photographer to document my supposedly illegal structures. "Well," I said, closing the folder and handing it back to her, "I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. I'll be sure to look into it." Patricia seemed surprised that I wasn't arguing or getting defensive. "You have 30 days, Mr. Webb. After that, the fines begin accumulating daily." I watched them drive away, noting the license plate numbers and the fact that their vehicles had magnetic signs advertising Pine Valley Property Solutions, along with the HOA logos. After 30 years in federal inspection work, I'd developed a nose for fraud, and everything about this morning reeked of it. My first call was to Tom Bradley, the county clerk I'd known since moving to the valley. Tom had helped me update my property tax records when I inherited the ranch, and he'd always been straight with me about local regulations. "Marcus," Tom said when I explained what had happened, "I've never heard of any Pine Valley Community Development Zone. Your property has been classified as agricultural, residential, since the 1940s. No HOA has any authority over unincorporated county land." That's what I thought. "Can you pull the original permits for my buildings?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Actually, that's interesting you ask. Someone else requested those same records last week. A woman from some property management company. I gave her copies of everything we had on file." My blood pressure spiked. "What exactly did you give her?" "All the building permits, inspection records, and property surveys dating back to the original homestead filing." "Why? Is there a problem?" I explained about Patricia's visit and her claims about missing permits. Tom was silent for a long moment before speaking. "Marcus, someone's been feeding you a line of bull. Every building on your property is properly permitted and documented. In fact, your grandfather was meticulous about following procedures. We've got inspection records for electrical, plumbing, and structural work dating back to the original construction." After hanging up with Tom, I spent an hour going through my grandfather's old files. He'd kept everything: permits, inspection certificates, correspondence with county officials, even receipts for materials. The man had documented the construction of our ranch like he was building a federal courthouse. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. But Patricia Morrison had walked onto my property with official-looking documents claiming none of that paperwork existed. Either she was incompetent, or she was running some kind of scam. Given my experience with bureaucratic fraud, I was betting on the scam. That afternoon, I drove into town to do some research. Pine Valley was a growing community, attracting retirees and city folks looking for mountain living. New developments were sprouting up around the valley, most of them gated communities with strict HOA rules and high property values. The kind of places where people paid premium prices to escape the chaos of urban life. At the local diner, I struck up a conversation with Beth, a waitress who'd lived in the valley her entire life. She knew everyone and everything that happened in a 20-mile radius. "Patricia Morrison?" Beth said when I mentioned the name. "Oh, honey, you don't want to mess with her. She's been stirring up trouble all over the valley. Claims she's protecting property values, but mostly she seems to enjoy making people miserable." "What kind of trouble?" Beth lowered her voice and leaned in. She started with the new developments, which made sense since those folks actually signed HOA agreements. But lately, she's been expanding her territory, claiming authority over properties that were here long before her developments existed. Has anyone fought back? A few tried. Old Pete Hendricks owns a cabin up on Moose Creek. Been in his family since the 1950s. Patricia showed up, claiming his place violated setback requirements and needed to be torn down. Cost Pete $5,000 in legal fees just to prove she had no authority over his land. Did he win? Eventually, but the stress gave him a heart attack. He sold the cabin and moved to Arizona. Patricia's group bought it through some shell company for half what it was worth. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't random harassment. This was a systematic campaign to drive out long-term property owners and acquire their land cheaply. Patricia Morrison wasn't just an overzealous HOA president. She was running a con game. That evening, I called my old partner from the federal inspector's office, Janet Rodriguez. Janet had transferred to the white-collar crime division after our building inspection unit was restructured, and she'd developed expertise in real estate fraud. "Marcus," Janet said after I explained the situation, "what you're describing sounds like a land grab scheme. It's more common than people think, especially in rapidly developing areas where property values are rising. How does it work?" "Usually involves fake documentation, fraudulent claims of authority, and intimidation tactics designed to force property owners into selling below market value. The scammers either buy the land themselves through shell companies or collect illegal fines and fees before disappearing." "What should I do?" "Document everything. Record conversations if it's legal in your state. And whatever you do, don't pay any fines or fees. The moment you acknowledge their authority by paying, you legitimize their claims." After talking with Janet, I spent the rest of the evening reviewing everything Patricia had given me. The violation notice was professionally printed but contained several red flags that my trained eye caught immediately. The legal references were either outdated, misquoted, or referred to codes that didn't exist in Montana. The survey map showed property boundaries that didn't match my deed or any county records. Most damning was the signature on the inspection report. It was supposedly signed by a county building inspector, John Patterson, but I knew every building inspector in 3 counties, and there was no John Patterson. A quick online search confirmed my suspicion. John Patterson had been a building inspector in Nevada who died in 2018. Someone was using a dead man's credentials to legitimize fraudulent inspection reports. I was dealing with professionals. This wasn't some neighborhood busybody with a power complex. This was organized fraud, with forged documents and stolen identities. Patricia Morrison had probably run this same scam in other communities before settling in Pine Valley. The next morning, I got a call from my neighbor, Carl Hoffman, who owned a small ranch about 2 miles down the valley. Carl was in his 70s, a retired schoolteacher who'd moved to Montana for the quiet life. "Marcus," Carl said, and I could hear the stress in his voice. "I got a visit from some hoe woman yesterday. She's claiming my barn needs to be torn down because it doesn't meet modern fire codes." "Patricia Morrison?" "That's her. She had some official-looking papers and took a bunch of photos. Said I had 30 days to remove the barn or face $50,000 in fines." Carl's barn was a beautiful log structure built in the 1940s by the property's original owner. It was solid, well-maintained, and had been grandfathered under every fire code update for the past 80 years. "Carl, don't sign anything and don't pay any fines. This woman has no authority over your property." But she showed me county documents, said the barn was a fire hazard to the community. "Those documents are fake. I'm going to help you fight this, but I need you to promise me you won't give her money or sign any agreements." After hanging up with Carl, I realized Patricia was casting a wider net. She wasn't just targeting my ranch. She was systematically hitting every long-term property owner in the valley, probably hoping that most would pay rather than fight. I spent the next few days quietly investigating. I drove around the valley, taking note of properties that had been recently sold or abandoned. I talked to longtime residents and business owners. The pattern became clear quickly. Over the past 18 months, at least a dozen longtime valley residents had either sold their properties at below-market prices or paid thousands in compliance fees to Patricia's organization. In every case, the properties were either purchased by companies connected to Pine Valley Property Solutions, or the owners had been intimidated into expensive improvements that drained their savings. The genius of the scam was its semi-legitimacy. Patricia wasn't claiming authority she obviously didn't have. Instead, she was creating just enough confusion about jurisdictions and regulations that victims either paid to make the problem go away or sold their properties to avoid the hassle. But she'd made a mistake targeting me. My 20 years as a federal building inspector had taught me exactly how real authority works and how to spot fake documentation. More importantly, I knew how to fight back. My first step was to contact the Montana Attorney General's office. I spoke with an investigator named Sarah Grace, who specialized in real estate fraud. Sarah was immediately interested when I explained the scope of Patricia's operation. "How many victims are we talking about?" Sarah asked. "At least 12 that I can confirm, probably more. Total losses are probably in the hundreds of thousands. Do you have documentation?" "I'm working on it, but I need to be careful. If Patricia realizes I'm investigating her, she might shut down the operation and move to another area." Sarah agreed to open a preliminary investigation while I gathered evidence. She also gave me the contact information for a federal prosecutor who'd been tracking similar schemes across the western states. That afternoon, I had an unexpected visitor. Patricia Morrison arrived alone this time, driving a silver Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. She was dressed more casually than during her first visit, but her demeanor was still aggressively official. "Mr. Webb," she said when I answered the door, "I wanted to follow up on our previous conversation. Have you had a chance to review the compliance requirements?" "I have," I said. "In fact, I've been doing quite a bit of research." Something flickered in her eyes. "Research? About building codes, property jurisdictions, that sort of thing. You know, given my background in federal building inspection, I like to understand the technical details." Patricia's smile faltered slightly. "Federal building inspection? 20 years with the General Services Administration. I've inspected everything from post offices to federal courthouses." It's amazing how much you learn about proper documentation and legitimate authority. I watched her process this information. She was clearly recalculating her approach, realizing that I wasn't the easy target she'd assumed. Well, she said carefully, I'm sure you appreciate the importance of bringing older structures up to modern standards. Absolutely. When the authority is legitimate and the standards actually exist. I smiled pleasantly. By the way, I tried to look up County Building Inspector John Patterson, the one who supposedly signed my violation report. Interesting story there. Patricia's face went pale. I'm not familiar with the specific personnel details. No, I imagine you're not. Since John Patterson died in Nevada 3 years ago, it would be pretty difficult to get his signature on a Montana inspection report. The silence stretched between us for a long moment. Patricia was clearly weighing her options. Double down on the lie, cut her losses, or try a different approach. There must be some confusion with the paperwork, she said finally. I'll have my office look into it. You do that. And while you're at it, you might want to check on your authority to conduct inspections on unincorporated county land. I spoke with the county clerk, and he's never heard of the Pine Valley Community Development Zone. Patricia straightened her shoulders, trying to regain some of her earlier confidence. Property development is a complex process, Mr. Webb. I'm sure a federal employee like yourself understands the importance of compliance with evolving regulations. Former federal employee? I corrected. And yes, I understand compliance very well. I also understand fraud, forgery, and extortion. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia stared at me for a moment, then turned and walked back to her Mercedes without another word. As she drove away, I noticed she was talking animatedly on her phone. That evening, Carl Hoffman called again. Marcus, something strange happened today. That Morrison woman came back to my place with 2 other people. They spent about an hour walking around my property and taking more photos. Did they talk to you? Briefly. She asked if I'd talked to any neighbors about the barn situation. I told her I'd mentioned it to a few people. What did she say to that? She seemed upset. Said something about how neighborhood gossip could complicate the compliance process. Then she asked specifically if I'd talked to you. What did you tell her? The truth. That you'd warned me not to pay any fines because she didn't have authority over my property. I could almost see Patricia's wheels turning. She now knew that I was actively working against her operation, probably warning other potential victims. That meant she'd either have to back down or escalate. Given what I'd learned about her pattern of behavior, I was betting on escalation. The next morning, I woke up to find a truck parked at the end of my driveway. It was a white pickup with Valley Building Inspections painted on the side. 2 men in hard hats were setting up surveying equipment on the county road, pointing it at my property. I walked down to talk to them, noting that their equipment looked professional but their behavior seemed more like performance than actual surveying. Morning, I said. Can I ask what you're surveying? The older of the 2 men looked uncomfortable. Property compliance inspection, sir. Checking structural integrity and code violations. On whose authority? Pine Valley HOA requested the survey for safety assessment. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Can I see your licenses and inspection credentials? Both men suddenly became very interested in their equipment. The younger one mumbled something about getting paperwork from the truck, while the older one started packing up the surveying gear. Actually, the older man said, we might need to reschedule this inspection. Technical difficulties with the equipment. They were gone within 5 minutes, leaving me with clear video evidence of Patricia's escalating intimidation tactics. She was now using fake building inspectors to harass me, probably hoping to create documentation for some kind of legal action. That afternoon, I got a call from Tom Bradley at the county clerk's office. Marcus, I thought you should know that someone filed a complaint against your property with the county building department. What kind of complaint? Anonymous tip claiming you've been doing unpermitted construction. They're requesting a full inspection of all structures on your property. When? The inspector is supposed to come out tomorrow morning. This was Patricia's next move. If she couldn't intimidate me with fake authority, she'd try to use real authority by filing false complaints with actual government agencies. The goal was probably to create bureaucratic headaches that would cost me time and money, even if the complaints were ultimately dismissed. Tom, who's the inspector they're sending? Dave Morrison. Good guy, been doing this for 15 years. I knew Dave slightly. He'd inspected some work I'd had done on my barn roof the previous year. More importantly, he was a professional who knew how to do his job properly. Thanks for the heads up, Tom. That evening, I called Dave Morrison directly. He was surprised to hear from me but listened carefully as I explained what had been happening. Dave, I know you have to respond to complaints, but I want you to know that this is part of a pattern of harassment by someone claiming HOA authority over my property. I figured something was up, Dave said. The complaint was pretty vague, and the person who filed it refused to give their name, but I still have to do the inspection. I understand. I'll be here tomorrow morning, and I'll have all my original permits and inspection records ready for you. Sounds good. Marcus, just between us, you might want to document this whole thing. If someone's filing false complaints, that's a criminal matter. The next morning, Dave Morrison arrived right on schedule. He was professional, thorough, and clearly knew what he was doing. I provided him with all my grandfather's original documentation, which impressed him with its completeness. Your grandfather was thorough, Dave said as he reviewed the permits. Everything's properly documented and signed off. The inspection took about 2 hours. Dave checked electrical systems, plumbing, structural integrity, and code compliance. He found exactly what I expected, a property that had been built to code and maintained properly for decades. Marcus, Dave said as he finished his paperwork, whoever filed this complaint was either misinformed or deliberately wasting county resources. Every structure on your property is in compliance and properly permitted. Will you be filing a report? Absolutely. And I'm going to recommend that the county investigate who filed the false complaint. This kind of thing wastes taxpayer money and clogs up the system for people with legitimate concerns. After Dave left, I felt like I'd won a small victory. Patricia had tried to use legitimate authority to harass me, but it had backfired. Now there was an official county record stating that her complaints were baseless. But I also knew she wasn't done. People running scams like this don't give up easily when they encounter resistance. They usually escalate until they either succeed or get caught. That afternoon, I got my answer about Patricia's next move. Carl Hoffman called in a panic. Marcus, they towed my truck. Who towed your truck? Some company called Valley Vehicle Recovery. They said it was parked illegally on HOA property and had to be impounded. It was in my own driveway. Where's your truck now? Some impound lot 30 miles away. They want $400 to release it, plus daily storage fees. This was a new level of boldness. Patricia was now claiming authority to tow vehicles from private property, probably using a legitimate towing company that didn't realize they were participating in a scam. Carl, don't pay them anything. I'm going to make some calls. My first call was to the sheriff's office. I explained the situation to Deputy Mike Collins, who'd handled some cattle theft cases for me the previous year. Marcus, if someone's towing vehicles from private property without authority, that's theft, period. Can you help get Carl's truck back? I'll drive out to the impound lot and straighten this out. If they can't prove they had legitimate authority to tow the vehicle, they'll release it immediately. My second call was to Sarah Grace at the Attorney General's office. Sarah, Patricia Morrison just escalated to vehicle theft. She's using a towing company to steal cars from private property. That's a felony, Sarah said immediately. How many victims? At least one confirmed, probably more. I think she's using legitimate businesses to commit crimes, so they don't realize they're part of a scam. We need to move fast before she realizes the heat is turning up and disappears. Can you get the victims together for interviews? I'll work on it. That evening, Deputy Collins called with an update. Marcus, I got Carl's truck back. The towing company was furious when they realized they'd been used to commit theft. Apparently, Patricia had some fake HOA documents claiming authority over Carl's property. Are they pressing charges? They're considering it. The towing company is out the cost of the tow and storage, plus they could face liability issues. They're not happy with Patricia Morrison right now. The next morning brought Patricia's boldest move yet. I was working in my barn when I heard vehicles approaching. Through the window, I saw a convoy that looked like a small army. Patricia's Mercedes, 2 trucks with Pine Valley security logos, and a van marked Environmental Assessment Services. Patricia emerged from her car wearing what looked like a uniform, complete with a badge and clipboard. The security guys were both big, muscular types who were clearly meant to be intimidating. The environmental team consisted of 2 people in coveralls carrying equipment. Patricia marched up to my barn like she owned the place. Mr. Webb, we're here to conduct a mandatory environmental assessment of your property. We've received reports of potential groundwater contamination from your agricultural operations. I stepped out of the barn and looked at the assembled team. And you have a warrant for this assessment? This is an emergency health inspection authorized under Pine Valley Environmental Protection Protocols. Failure to comply will result in immediate fines and potential criminal charges. What agency issued this authorization? Patricia handed me another official-looking document. The Pine Valley Environmental Protection Board, in coordination with County Health Services. I glanced at the document and had to suppress a laugh. It was even more obviously fake than her previous paperwork. The legal citations were wrong, the formatting was amateurish, and it was signed by someone claiming to be a Director of Regional Environmental Compliance, a position that didn't exist in Montana government. This is interesting, I said, pulling out my phone. Let me call the county health department and confirm this assessment. That won't be necessary, Patricia said quickly. We're working under emergency authorization protocols. Oh, I think it is necessary. I dialed the county health department while Patricia and her team watched. Hi, this is Marcus Webb on Elk Creek Road. I've got some people here claiming to be conducting an emergency environmental assessment on behalf of your department. Can you confirm this? After a brief conversation, I hung up and smiled at Patricia. Interesting news. The county health department has no record of any environmental concerns on my property, no authorization for any assessments, and no knowledge of the Pine Valley Environmental Protection Board. Patricia's face went through several color changes, but she wasn't backing down. There must be some communication error between agencies. We still need to conduct the assessment. That's when I decided to end this charade. Patricia, you're trespassing on private property with no legitimate authority. You're impersonating government officials, which is a felony, and you're attempting to defraud me with fake documentation. I don't know what you're talking about. I held up my phone, which had been recording the entire conversation. I'm sure the FBI will be very interested in your environmental protection protocols, especially since impersonating federal environmental officials is a federal crime. The security guys suddenly looked very uncomfortable. They were probably legitimate security personnel who'd been hired with false information about their purpose. The environmental assessment team had already started backing toward their van. You don't know who you're dealing with, Patricia said, her mask finally slipping completely. I have connections throughout this county, political connections, business connections. You're just some washed-up federal employee living in the middle of nowhere. Actually, I said, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Sarah Grace at the Montana Attorney General's office is very interested in meeting you. So is the federal prosecutor handling real estate fraud cases in the Western District? Patricia's eyes went wide. She'd finally realized that she wasn't dealing with an isolated retiree who could be intimidated into submission. She was dealing with someone who understood both the law and the system well enough to use them effectively. This isn't over, she said, gathering her fake paperwork and heading back to her car. Actually, I called after her, I think it is. As Patricia's convoy retreated down my driveway, I called Sarah Grace with an update. Sarah, Patricia just tried to conduct a fake environmental assessment with impersonated officials. I have the whole thing recorded. Perfect. That's federal impersonation charges on top of the state fraud charges. We're ready to move. Can you get the victims together for a meeting tomorrow? Absolutely. That afternoon, I spent hours calling every long-term resident in the valley I could reach. By evening, I had commitments from 8 victims to meet the next day and share their stories with the Attorney General's investigators. The meeting was held at the community center in town. Sarah Grace brought 2 other investigators and a federal prosecutor. One by one, the victims told their stories: fake violations, fraudulent fines, intimidation tactics, and in some cases, financial losses that had destroyed their savings. Carl Hoffman described the attempted vehicle theft. Pete Hendricks drove up from Arizona to tell his story about the $5,000 legal battle over his cabin. An elderly woman named Martha Stevens broke down crying as she described paying $8,000 in fake compliance fees because she couldn't afford to fight Patricia's threats. The pattern was clear and damning. Patricia Morrison had been running a systematic fraud operation targeting vulnerable property owners with fake authority and fabricated violations. The total financial damage exceeded $200,000, not counting the emotional trauma and the properties that had been lost to forced sales. How soon can you arrest her? I asked Sarah after the victim interviews were complete. We're executing warrants tomorrow morning. Patricia Morrison, 3 accomplices, and the shell companies they've been using to launder money. The arrests happened at dawn. I wasn't there to see it, but Carl Hoffman drove by Patricia's house and called me with a play-by-play. Marcus, they've got FBI agents, state investigators, and county deputies. Patricia came out in handcuffs, screaming about prosecutorial misconduct and political persecution. What about her accomplices? They arrested 2 guys at the Pine Valley Property Solutions office and some woman who was running the fake towing scam. Looks like they're rolling up the whole operation. That afternoon, the local newspaper called for an interview. By evening, the story was picked up by state media. "Federal retiree exposes real estate fraud ring," read the headline. The story detailed Patricia's systematic targeting of longtime residents and her eventual downfall when she picked the wrong victim. But the real satisfaction came a week later when I got a call from Pete Hendricks. "Marcus, I just wanted to thank you. The prosecutor says I'll be getting full restitution for my legal fees, plus damages. But more importantly, I feel like justice was actually served. What are you going to do now?" "I'm thinking about moving back to Montana. Maybe buying that cabin back if it's available." 6 months later, Patricia Morrison pled guilty to 14 felony counts, including fraud, extortion, and impersonation of government officials. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to her victims. The Pine Valley Property Solutions shell companies were dissolved, and their assets were seized to pay victim compensation. Several legitimate businesses that had been unknowingly used in the scam, including the towing company, cooperated fully with the investigation and avoided charges. As for me, I went back to the quiet retirement I'd originally planned. My ranch remained exactly as it had always been, properly permitted, legally compliant, and free from the interference of fake authorities. The only change was a new sign at the end of my driveway that read, "No HOA jurisdiction, federal inspector retired here." Sometimes justice comes slowly, but when it comes, it's worth the wait. Patricia Morrison had spent months terrorizing innocent people with fake authority and fraudulent documentation. In the end, she learned what real authority looks like when it's backed by actual law and genuine expertise. The valley is peaceful again. Property owners know their rights. Local businesses understand the difference between legitimate and fake authorities. And newcomers to the area are warned about real estate scams. It's amazing how much trouble one person with false credentials can cause, and how much peace one person with real knowledge can restore. Patricia Morrison thought she could build an empire on forged documents and intimidation tactics. Instead, she built herself a federal prison sentence. And my grandfather's ranch, built with honest work and proper permits nearly a century ago, stands exactly where it belongs, on land that has never needed fake authority to validate its existence. 2 years after Patricia Morrison's sentencing, I received a phone call that reminded me why fighting corruption matters beyond just the immediate victims. The caller was Detective Linda Chase from Missoula County, and she had news that both surprised and vindicated everything we'd accomplished. "Mr. Webb," Detective Chase said, "I'm calling because your Patricia Morrison case has helped us crack a much larger operation. We've been tracking a network of real estate fraudsters operating across 4 states, and your documentation was the key that broke it open." "How so?" "The shell companies Patricia used, the fake inspection credentials, even some of the forged documents, they all traced back to a larger organization. Your case provided the evidence chain we needed to identify the masterminds." It turned out that Patricia hadn't been a lone operator. She was part of a sophisticated network that recruited local accomplices in rapidly developing rural areas across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. The network provided training, fake documentation templates, and even legal support for their franchisees. Patricia had been one of their most successful operators before she made the mistake of targeting someone who knew how to fight back. "We've arrested 12 people so far," Detective Chase continued, "and recovered over $2 million in stolen assets. The victims spanned dozens of communities. Without your case documentation, we never would have been able to connect all the pieces." The revelation that Patricia's operation was part of something much larger changed how I viewed our victory. We hadn't just stopped one scammer, we'd helped expose and dismantle an entire criminal network that was preying on vulnerable property owners across the region. 3 months later, I got another unexpected call. This time, it was from a man named Robert Garcia, who lived in a rural community outside Bozeman. "Mr. Webb, I read about your case in the newspaper. I think I'm dealing with something similar." Robert's story was painfully familiar. A woman claiming to represent a new regional planning authority had been targeting longtime property owners in his area, claiming their homes and outbuildings violated updated environmental regulations. She was demanding expensive compliance assessments and threatening legal action against those who refused to pay. "The difference is," Robert said, "I'm not a federal inspector. I'm just a retired mechanic. I don't know how to fight this kind of thing." That conversation planted a seed that grew into something I hadn't expected when I first retired to my peaceful ranch. Over the following months, I found myself becoming an informal consultant for rural property owners facing similar scams. Word spread through informal networks, coffee shops, feed stores, community bulletin boards, that there was someone who understood how these fraudsters operated and how to stop them. My kitchen table became an unofficial command center for investigating suspicious property claims across western Montana. I helped a rancher near Great Falls expose a fake agricultural compliance inspector who was demanding thousands in bogus fees. I assisted a group of cabin owners near Glacier National Park who were being harassed by someone claiming to enforce non-existent federal wilderness regulations. Each case taught me more about how these scams evolved and adapted. The fraudsters had learned from Patricia's mistakes, becoming more sophisticated in their documentation and more careful about their targets. But they all shared the same fundamental weakness. They relied on victims not understanding the real legal system well enough to challenge fake authority. Sarah Grace from the Attorney General's office began consulting with me regularly on rural fraud cases. "Marcus," she said during one of our meetings, "you've become our unofficial expert on property-related fraud schemes. Have you ever considered making this official?" "What do you mean?" "The state is creating a new position, Rural Property Rights Advocate. It would involve investigating suspicious claims, educating property owners about their rights, and coordinating with law enforcement on fraud cases. Interested?" I thought about it for weeks. Part of me wanted to maintain my quiet retirement, but another part realized that my unique combination of federal inspection experience and first-hand fraud victim knowledge could help a lot of people. The final decision came when I received a letter from Martha Stevens, the elderly woman who had lost $8,000 to Patricia's fake compliance fees. "Dear Mr. Webb," Martha wrote, "I wanted to let you know that I used the restitution money to finally take that trip to visit my grandchildren in Oregon. For the first time in years, I'm not afraid that someone's going to show up at my door claiming I owe them money for violations I don't understand. Thank you for giving me back my peace of mind." I called Sarah Grace the next day and accepted the position. The rural property rights advocate role allowed me to formalize what I'd been doing informally. I developed educational materials explaining property rights, created a network of contacts in county clerk offices across the state, and established protocols for quickly identifying and investigating suspicious authority claims. One of my first official cases involved a group of retirees in the Bitterroot Valley who were being targeted by someone claiming to enforce regional water management compliance regulations. The scammer was demanding expensive well inspections and threatening to shut off water access for non-compliance. Using the investigation techniques I'd developed during the Patricia Morrison case, I was able to expose the fraud within 2 weeks and help recover over $30,000 in illegal fees. The work was satisfying in a way that my federal inspection career had never been. Instead of checking compliance with existing regulations, I was protecting people from fake regulations designed to steal their money and property. Every successful case meant that families could stay in their homes, that lifelong savings weren't lost to scammers, and that rural communities remained stable. The years that followed were a whirlwind of activity and unforeseen responsibility. What began as an attempt to reclaim the peace I thought I'd earned in retirement blossomed into a full-time mission, safeguarding the rights of rural property owners and dismantling the corrosive tactics of those who prey on ignorance. As the rural property rights advocate, I found myself in boardrooms, courtrooms, and community halls from the foothills of the Bitterroot Valley to the sprawling ranchlands near Great Falls. By the time my office officially opened its doors, just a converted corner of my grandfather's old workshop, I had already amassed more case files than I ever thought possible. Sitting at that worn workbench, the one my grandfather had used to build the very barn I'd spent so much time restoring, I often reflected on how far I'd come from the solitary days of sipping coffee on my front porch. Back then, 6 a.m. meant an early cup and a moment of quiet contemplation. Now, it meant briefing an entire team of investigators over video conference about a suspected hijacking of zoning authority in rural Ravalli County. Gone were the leisurely mornings. Each day was a sprint from one phone call to the next. Yet, the busyness felt good. It felt just and necessary. One particularly memorable morning, I found myself on the phone with a young couple from northwest Idaho. They had purchased a small piece of land overlooking a glacial Riviera place they hoped would be their permanent escape from city life. 2 weeks into their ownership, they received a letter bearing the seal of an organization called the North Idaho Heritage Compliance Authority. According to the letter, their new cabin violated supposed riparian preservation statutes enacted 2 months prior. The compliance fine was $12,500, immediately payable, with instructions to hire an approved assessor or face liens on the property. They had panicked, believing they'd fallen victim to a genuine environmental regulation they couldn't even have anticipated. They were frantic. This was their life savings. Over a lunch of cold roast beef sandwiches delivered to my workshop because all I seemed to eat these days were whatever I could grab between calls. I walked them through the steps of verifying the authenticity of that seal, the signatures, and the supposed new statutes. We checked the Idaho State Legislature website, the county recorder's notices, and cross-referenced every claimed citation to find nothing matched up. The seal was a crude copy of the actual county emblem, the signature was a digital forgery, and no such statutes existed. I coached them on how to respond, send a certified letter demanding proof of authority, inform local law enforcement, and share the correspondence with me. By the time I hung up, their relief was palpable. Within a month, the scammers behind the North Idaho Heritage Compliance Authority had been unmasked. The couple never paid a dime. Later, they asked if they could visit my ranch to express their gratitude in person. They arrived in a dusty Jeep, bringing crate after crate of homemade pies and local produce, a gesture that reminded me, in a visceral way, why I carried on this work. Another case that imprinted itself on my mind involved a cluster of immigrant families on the outskirts of Bozeman. They were seasonal farm workers who had pooled resources to buy a modest tract of land where they could grow organic produce. They thought they were doing everything by the book, permits applied for, small greenhouse erected to start seedlings, and a barn structure that met county guidelines. One morning, they woke to find a group of men in suits and ties taking photographs of their greenhouse and barn, claiming to represent the Bozeman Regional Agricultural Oversight Council. The men asserted the structures were non-compliant with updated agrarian heritage codes and demanded immediate demolition or a fine of $25,000. Because the families spoke limited English and were unfamiliar with county nuances, they nearly gave up and sold at a steep loss. Word of their plight reached the Montana Legal Aid Network, who then called me. I agreed to meet them at the community center. The unease crackled in the room as I introduced myself and described my background. Once they understood I was a former federal building inspector turned rural advocate, their shoulders visibly relaxed. We spent hours translating the language of the supposed agrarian heritage codes into plain English, verifying that no such codes had been enacted, and documenting the sham credentials of the men in suits. When I discovered that the ringleader had been previously arrested for running a similar scam in Eastern Oregon, convicted under state impersonation statutes, I knew we had the leverage to stop him. By coordinating with state prosecutors and local sheriffs, we arrested the ringleader and his associates within 10 days. The immigrant families kept their land, and the incident galvanized support for minority property rights across southwestern Montana. Yet, not every victory was so clear-cut. I recall the case of an elderly rancher named Earl Stimson, whose sprawling property near Hamilton had been in his family since 1912. Earl, tall, stoic, and fiercely proud, had refused to pay what he was told were heritage conservation fees, totaling $15,000, unless he updated his century-old barn to meet fictional century structure preservation standards. He'd fought tooth and nail for weeks, refusing to budge, and each refusal earned him starker threats. When he reached out to me, I discovered that Patricia Morrison's compatriots, this time operating under a different banner, were behind the threats. Although the forged paperwork bore the stamps of a Montana Heritage Infrastructure Council, it was all smoke and mirrors. I flew down to Hamilton, sat with Earl on the porch of his main house, and told him what I knew. As we pored over scanned documents, comparisons between genuine county records and the bogus material, she finally let out a long, exhausted sigh. Together, we filed a lawsuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress, naming every individual linked to that fake council. The lawsuit ran for almost a year, but eventually, the scammers were ordered to pay Earl not only the invalid fees but also punitive damages. Chief among the awards was the restoration of Earl's dignity, which he often remarked was more valuable than any financial award. Through all these cases, my workshop gradually transformed. Where once I had stacks of ranch tools and paint cans, I now had binders labeled case files, template verifications, and local contacts. The walls that once bore sketches of cattle grazing along mesquite hills now displayed laminated flowcharts, outlining steps to verify any purported authority claim. Check official county or state websites, verify seals and signatures, consult local law enforcement, and only then respond. Visiting property owners would frequently ask to tour these walls, taking pictures with their phones for reference. In a way, the workshop itself became an educational exhibit, a living testament to what rural residents needed to know to protect themselves.